All right, so today we're going to be talking about how the Industrial Revolution spread, or in some cases didn't. So we're going to start by talking about how the Industrial Revolution spreads from Britain to sort of Western continental Europe, and then we're going to be looking at why Eastern and Central and Southern Europe and the colonies didn't actually industrialize at the same rate as Western Europe. They'll get there eventually, but not during this early part of the 19th century. All right, so industrialization on the continent. So the countries that sort of followed Britain's lead and industrialized during the early or mid 1800s, we're going to look at the Netherlands, Belgium, France, and the German states, and especially the northern German states like Prussia. So Prussia is going to become one of our big industrial leaders as well. Now, in contrast, countries that didn't industrialize during this time period, so they're going to industrialize later, so not until the end of the century or the early 20th century. So Eastern, Southern, and Central Europe. And then Europe is also going to actively suppress industrial development in some of its overseas colonies like India, and we'll look at that a bit later as well. Now, why were some of these countries, quote unquote, ahead of other countries? Well, people noticed this discrepancy in the 19th century, and because the 19th century was wildly racist, as we'll find out as well, people during the 19th century came up with some really bizarre explanations for why some countries industrialized and some didn't. So they pointed to things like climate and people's inherent characteristics, and in some cases, even diet. And my quote unquote favorite example of this, there was a German philosopher named Friedrich Nietzsche who was like, oh yeah, China hasn't industrialized at the same rate as Europe. That must be because people in China eat rice. What? I don't know how we got there, but that just illustrates the kind of explanations that people in the 19th century were coming up with. Obviously, these are wrong. There are a lot of forces going on here that we'll look at, and we'll explain why some countries didn't industrialize at the same rate. And then one thing I want to point out too before we move on, your textbook does a little of this as well, sort of pointing to like inherent characteristics versus structural factors. So I just want to leave you with this quote here: continental entrepreneurs, so people in continental Europe like Britain and, not Britain, France and Germany, were generally less enterprising than their British counterparts and tended to adhere to traditional business attitudes. So again, even your textbook is trying to say like people's inherent characteristics apparently changed how industrialization happened. I don't buy that, but that's just me. All right, so let's talk about some of the actual obstacles to industrialization that make a little bit more sense. So on the continent, there were some factors that sort of limited industrialization or caused it to happen a little bit more slowly or look a little bit different. So a lot of places on the continent had less transportation infrastructure than Britain. So that was something that we looked at last time. That was a really big advantage. And then places, even though, as we mentioned during the absolutism unit, even though in places like Prussia and France, rulers did try and put in some more transportation infrastructure, it still wasn't as well developed as it was in Britain. So that's the first thing. Next thing is that the guild system, which was this network of trade and craft associations that was sort of associated all the way back to the Middle Ages, it was actually a sort of a hindrance to industrialization, and while it was dying out, it was still stronger on the continent than in Britain. So just fewer people looking for work in factories, essentially. And then Britain also, another reason why industrialization was slower to develop in continental Europe is that Britain actively suppressed it. That's going to be a theme today, by the way. So they try to prevent skilled workers from going abroad and sharing their knowledge. And they also try to prevent the export of machinery. But their efforts ultimately failed. People wanted that information, so they got it. So by 1840, most of Western Europe had quote unquote caught up to Britain. But because of the obstacles described above and sort of different approaches of the government to industrialization in these countries, industrialization on the continent is going to look a little bit different, and the government's going to be much more involved. So let's take a look at what that looked like. All right. So as you recall, right, the British government's attitude towards industrialization was very hands-off, right? This goes back to that idea of that Enlightenment Scottish philosopher Adam Smith, who believed in laissez-faire economics, right? So he believed that the economy functions best when the government stays out of it completely. So the British government wasn't really involved with regulations or subsidies or tariffs or any of that kind of economic regulation. But in contrast, continental governments were much more actively involved in the government, right? And again, this is one of those legacies of absolutism, right? In England, we had kings try to become absolutists. They really failed, right? They didn't practice those mercantilist policies that we really saw on the continent in places like France and Prussia. But in France and Prussia and places like that, there is a legacy of that. So the government's much more involved, even way down on the line in the 19th century, in the economy. So what did continental governments do? Well, they granted money to entrepreneurs and to factories, right? And that helped industrialization develop. They built more transportation infrastructure, so catching up there, and then they instituted tariffs. Now, you might be saying, wait, tariffs, building infrastructure, granting subsidies, isn't this just mercantilism again? Why are we now saying the economy is different? Well, the difference here between sort of absolutist mercantilism and what we see here, so this development of commercial capitalism, the entrepreneurs are really leading the way. It's not the government really setting a policy, it's them just trying to spur something that is already happening. All right, let's look at some regions that didn't industrialize during this time period. So they are going to industrialize, like I mentioned, but it's going to be a little bit later. And we're going to look specifically at some case studies. So we're going to look at Russia. We mentioned, right, that Eastern and Central and Southern Europe don't really industrialize at the same rate. Well, you're going to use Russia as a case study. And then we're going to look at India. And then we're going to come actually back to Europe and we're going to look at Ireland. Ireland's not really an overseas colony, but Britain treated it kind of like one. So we're going to use that as a case study as well. So let's start with Russia. We know Russia is really one of our big power players in Europe at this time. And we know that with Peter the Great, they were really focused on developing their country and becoming more like Western Europe. So the question here is, well, why didn't that continue into the 19th century? So what's going on here? Well, Russia had a couple of obstacles that kind of limited industrialization and development. And the first one was kind of ideological. So by the time we get to the 19th century, the Russian czars, unlike Peter the Great, are a lot less interested in sort of quote unquote modernizing or developing or becoming more like Western Europe. So they still got this primarily agricultural economy and they aren't really interested in changing that. Well, why not? Well, culturally in Russia during this time, as you can imagine, after getting invaded by Napoleon, they're not super friendly towards the West right now. There's sort of differences within sort of Russian society, but for the most part, the monarchy is not really oriented towards the West right now. So they're like, why bother? Why do we want to be like them? We're going to focus on building our own selves up, right? And we're going to focus on this agricultural tradition that we have. So kind of following from that, Russia didn't really have a strong middle class. We've talked about that before. And you really need that for sort of commercial capitalism and industrialization to develop, because that middle class, that's where your entrepreneurs are coming from. So your people who are starting factories, that's where they come from. Russia didn't really have that. You've got nobles and you've got serfs and you've not really got a lot in between. So that limited industrialization as well. And then again, like I mentioned, serfs. So Russia had serfdom until 1861. So what that means is, in contrast to Britain, right, where you have all these poor people in the countryside coming to the cities looking for work because their lands got enclosed, right? Well, you don't have that in Russia. People are still working the lands in the countryside because they're literally, well, not literally, they are tied to the land legally, right? They can't leave their land to go to the cities and look for work. So what that means is even if you're an entrepreneur and you do want to start a factory, you don't have people to work in your factory because they're all working on the farms. All right, so now let's talk about the colonies. So why didn't places like India or the African colonies, why didn't they industrialize at the same rate as Europe? Well, really the big reason here is that Europeans actively suppressed industrialization in those countries. So let's look at India, right? So really India's importance to Britain was as a source of raw cotton. Now Britain was like, okay, well, this is problematic, right? Because we want to get cotton from India, but we don't want India to develop a textile industry. So we don't want them to start using their own cotton to develop fabrics, right? Well, why not? Because then that's competition with Britain, right? So now Britain would have to compete with them, and they don't want that. They want basically a monopoly on the textile industry. So what do, right? Well, at this point, the British East India Company is still kind of like the de facto ruler of India. So you've got like this British company that's sort of tied to the government, ruling India essentially, right? And what they did is they actively limited industrialization in India by cutting off access to land and to credit. So if you are someone in India and you want to start a factory and you want to manufacture textiles because there's all these cotton farms around you and you want to make use of that, well, Britain's going to make it harder for you to buy land where you can put that factory. They're going to prevent you from getting loans so that you have money to buy the machinery that you need and hire the workers that you need, right? So really hindering potential Indian entrepreneurs there. Now, the British also crowded out Indian textile sellers. So even if you do manage to start your own textile factory in India, what are the British going to do to you? So what Britain did is, because their textiles were produced by machine instead of by hand, it was much easier and cheaper to produce them. So what this means was Britain would go and they would produce textiles back textiles with Indian cotton back in Britain, and then they would come and they would sell those textiles in India for much cheaper than what people in India were able to sell their textiles for, because they were making them by hand. So as a result, more and more Indian textile makers were pushed out of the market because their goods were too expensive, and more Indian people were forced by the quote unquote invisible hand of the market, because prices are cheaper, to buy British goods, right? So it really gave Britain a lot of economic dominance over India. All right, now let's turn our attention. We're actually going to come back to Europe, and let's look at another case study here. So why didn't Ireland industrialize at the same rate as everybody else, or Western Europe and the UK, or Britain, excuse me. So Ireland, rather, is part of the UK at this point, and they're not a colony of the English, but there's definitely some subjugation going on here, and this has a lot to do with sort of the religious dynamic. So Ireland is mostly Catholic, England, as we know, is Protestant, and this tension has been going back all the way to the English Civil War. So as you remember, right, Cromwell invaded Ireland and he pretty much trounced them, right? So what's going on in Ireland? Well, most of the land in Ireland is not owned by Irish people. It's kind of like India, actually. It's mostly owned by English landlords, and Irish people work on the land, but they don't own it, right? So they have to rent their land from their English landlords, right? Now, most Irish plots of land were really, really small. So Irish people mostly grew crops that would get them sort of the most nutritional bang for their buck, which at this point was potatoes, right? You can basically survive off of potatoes and milk and you'll be fine and you won't develop any nutritional deficiencies. So Ireland really relies on potatoes as like a staple crop, right? And because potatoes are so nutritious, Ireland's population really, really grows dramatically between the late 1700s and the early 1800s. But then, as you can imagine, right, if you put all your eggs in one basket and you rely only on one crop, if that crop develops some sort of blight, so some sort of illness, that can be really bad, right? So in 1845 to 1851, this disease, so a potato blight, decimated the Irish potato crop, which led to the death of 1 million Irish people and the emigration of 2 million more, actually mostly to the United States, actually. So Ireland has a total population of 8 million and they lose 3 million. So if you can imagine that, it's an enormous tragedy. We're like, wait, what the heck does this have to do with industrialization and capitalism and Britain? All right. So the British actually make the famine worse, right? So it starts as a natural famine, but British policy makes it significantly worse. So if you were British, right, so or English rather, what's your option here? Do you give the Irish renters more land so they can diversify their crops? Do you distribute some of the other crops that these English landlords are growing back to the Irish people? No, Britain does neither of these things. So they're growing all this food, right? And they just export it back to England. They don't give it to Irish people. So, and not only that, right, exports during this time period actually increase. So Ireland has grown a heck ton of food, but it's not available to Irish people. So really, the villain of the 19th century is England. And on that happy note, I'll see you next time.